couple of administrative points. The webinar will be recorded. It's also live on Facebook. Please keep your microphones muted throughout the webinar. If you would like to ask a question, please post a chat message. At the end of the presentation, we'll have some time to go over those questions. Our speaker today is Daron Acemoglu, who is an institute professor at MIT and an elected fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Econometric Society, and the Society of Labor Economists. His academic work covers a wide range of areas, including political economy, economic development, economic growth, inequality, labor economics, and economics of networks. He's the author of 5 books, including Why Nations Fail, Power, Prosperity, and Poverty, and The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty, both with James Robinson. Professor Acemoglu has received numerous awards and prizes, including the Carnegie Fellowship in 2017, the Jean-Jacques Lafont Prize in 2018, and the Global Economy Prize in 2019. He was awarded the John Bates Clark Medal in 2005, the Irving Klein Nemers Prize in 2012, and the 2016 BBVA Frontiers of Knowledge Award. Today, Professor Acemoglu is giving talk for UA community, and the title of his presentation is Challenges and Opportunities in a Turbulent World. Welcome, Daron. Thank you for doing this webinar. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Armen. It's a great pleasure to be here. We have all gotten used to Zoom talks. It's not great for seeing people and getting their reactions, but hopefully I'll hear some of your reactions when you ask questions at the end, and I encourage people to ask questions in person as well, as well as via chat. We'll have 20 minutes for that. So let me share my screen and get started. So I wanted to talk about something that is relevant for the diverse group of listeners that I expect might be tuning in. So it's not going to be about the US or Armenia, but more broadly about the world. And I'm going to share with you why I think we are actually in a particularly turbulent period, and not that that really requires much elaboration given the situation we are in, but that I'm going to dwell on 4 challenges that I think will define the next decade or 2, and also in each case highlight that they come with some opportunities, though not always easy to grab, and also emphasize that COVID has typically made many of these challenges more difficult to deal with. So I'm going to talk about aging, demographic change affecting many of the world's labor markets, automation, what's going on to democratic institutions, and collapse of international corporations. The missing in this list is the all-important climate change. And the reason for that is because I want to focus on issues that are more immediate than climate change. And I have written a lot on climate change, but getting into that today would have made it impossible to cover the rest. So I'm going to focus on those 4 issues. So here is what the evolution of the world and OECD labor forces looks like since 1950 and projected all the way to 2050. If you take OECD, for example, given by the blue curve, it's
Please unmute yourself.
Thank you. So if you look at the OECD shown by the blue curve, about half, a little bit more than half of the population above the age of 20 was actually above the age of 50. So those who are in the older bracket were more or less balanced with the younger 20 to 49-year-olds in the 1950s. That slowly edged up to the 1990s, and then started a big inflection. So much so that by 2050, we expect the over 50s to be 3 times as much as those under the age of 20 and 49. The world is behind, of course, is younger. There are many countries in Africa, Latin America, South Asia that are somewhat younger than the OECD, European, North American countries. But in broad strokes, the general change is similar. There's going to be a huge acceleration in the fraction of the population that is older. Now, this raises a lot of issues. The demand structure is going to change. What people want in terms of the goods they want to consume. Occupations that are going to be more dependent on younger workers might have problems. There's going to be a larger fraction of the population that may be retired or less active or perhaps less productive if you believe that the younger individuals are more important for entrepreneurship, for the workforce, for other aspects of pushing the economy forward. And I can say that since I'm in the over 50 group now. And also, there are many macroeconomic theories that emphasize that a large increase in aging is going to be associated with too much saving, not enough investment, and can bring long-run recessions or depressions. Well, how has the world fared with this aging? Well, one way of looking at that is compare countries that have aged faster to those that haven't. So if you do that, for example, looking at the change from 1990 to 2015, the change in that ratio of older to younger workers, and how these countries that are on the right-hand side of this graph here, like just Japan, Singapore, Korea, and many of the European countries, fared relative to those much of Latin America, Armenia somewhere in the middle here, and Africa. Well, actually, both within the OECD, which are given by the orange diamonds, and outside of OECD, which are the blue dots, you don't see any negative relationship here. More rapidly aging countries are not growing any slower. In fact, it's a slight positive slope, but I wouldn't say they're growing much faster either. So somehow, despite all of these challenges that aging is going to create, or is expected to create, or has been argued to have already created, we don't see any big economic problem relative to the rest of the world. I'll come back to what the rest of the world's problems may be in a second. But even Japan, which is probably the test case for many people who say aging has generated lots of problems, actually, when you take this whole period, 1990 to 2015, hasn't done so much badly. It's a little bit below the line, but not too much. What's going on? Well, my analysis is that these countries have made adjustments, so responded to the challenge of aging by exploiting the opportunities that aging brings as well. And in particular, an aging workforce cannot do certain occupations, but can do others very well. And they have adjusted their technology. Chief among the occupations that are a challenge for aging workforces are those that require a lot of manual skills, such as blue-collar works. So what you can see here, I'm showing it for a few countries, and I'll show it for the whole sample in the next slide, that if you look at the most rapidly aging countries, such as Germany, here shown with the green diamonds, or South Korea, which started one of the youngest populations in the 1960s and became one of the oldest in the world, shown by the crosses. They have been the ones that have adopted the fastest the number of industrial robots that substitute for younger workers that have become in shortage, that have become scarce in these economies. And this is a general pattern. Here I'm showing change in the robots per millions of hours worked in industry between 1993 and 2015 versus the same variable of change in the ratio of older to younger workers from 1990 to 2015. Again, the same color coding, diamonds for OECD and blue for non-OECD. And what you see is a very powerful positive relationship. The faster a country ages, the more robots it has adopted. I won't go into it, but this relationship looks causal and fairly robust. So it highlights one aspect of how you can adjust to a potentially transformative change. Not every country has been able to do this adjustment. Some countries, despite their aging, have not really done a good job of investing in robots. And we'll see there is another problem with robot adoption in a second. But it is a showcase. It showcases the possibility of some sort of economic, and I will show in a second, social adjustment. But the COVID crisis is going to make these things much worse. Why? Because one of the areas where older workers have specialized in many countries is actually service industry. And the service jobs have become much more uncertain in the midst of the COVID crisis. And that's going to create another layer of problems and on top of automation. And as I'm going to argue in a second, actually, there are other trends in automation that will also complicate the picture. The second point I want to develop is about the effects of automation. So in some sense, what I have shown you so far is the good side of automation or robots. If an economy is undergoing rapid aging and generates a scarcity of workers with manual skills, these new technologies can help adjustment. But there's also a dark side of automation, I'm going to argue, which is that its adoption has often gone in a rather unbalanced way, and it has changed the character and face of both US and other developed economy labor markets, and is now starting to have direct and indirect effects on developing economies. So to make that point, let me show you what has happened to US labor demand over the last 80 years. So on the left, I'm showing the private sector wage bill, employment times average wage, in the 4 decades right after World War II. This is a remarkable picture because what you see is a very rapid increase in labor demand. If you make the math, if you do the math, it comes to about 2.5 percentage points faster real wage bill growth than population. So what that implies is that in the US, as it was indeed the case, you could afford very rapid real wage growth for most workers because labor demand was growing. Employers were willing to pay much more to workers. Now, go to the right and you see a sea change. The wage bill, private sector wage bill first slows down and then flattens out almost completely here. So US businesses are not paying much more to workers than they did 20 years ago. This has had various sweeping implications. For one, there has been an unparalleled sharp decline in the share of national income that goes to labor. That used to hover around 66%, and in the course of about 20 years, it has fallen by about 10 percentage points. For another, and even more importantly, wage inequality has exploded, especially with real wage declines for workers, especially men, with low education. So here you can see that I'm showing the evolution of the real wages by 10 demographic groups, men and women, and by education, from high school dropout all the way to college graduates in the 1950s, and the same is true in the 1960s if you use other data sets. All of these groups were experiencing that 2.5% real wage growth. It's remarkable how much all these 10 lines are on top of each other. This was the period of shared prosperity. But starting from 1980, you have several very different trends. First, these curves are fanning out. Postgraduate degree workers are continuing to grow, increase wage growth, both for women and men, but not so for lower education. Overall wage growth is flat, and even workers with just college degrees, the light blue, who don't have postgraduate degrees, are not enjoying all that much, especially for men. And perhaps most socially relevant or consequential, men with high school education, orange, or high school dropout, red, have experienced quite notable declines in their real wages and real earnings. Of course, this is not unrelated to all of the social problems US has experienced. This is not a US phenomenon. The decline at the bottom of the wage distribution is specific to the US and the UK, which do not have very strong social safety nets, minimum wage regulations, and collective bargaining. But overall increase in inequality is very common across almost all OECD economies. Here I'm showing you with one measure of that, the Gini coefficient, which economists often use. Let me not get into how it's measured, but what all you need to know is that it's comparable across these countries. And what it shows is that income distribution has become much more unequal pretty much everywhere. US was most unequal to start with and has had some of the largest increases, but look at Sweden, Finland, New Zealand, they've had almost the same, or Germany, they've had almost the same increases, or sometimes slightly more. Why has this happened? Economists typically think of technology as the most powerful force that brings prosperity. And the simplified story that you will read in economics textbooks and some popular media discussions would be technological change increases productivity, and that productivity becomes shared as the labor market adjusts. For example, the sectoral composition adjusts. My own work in this area for the last 2.5 decades has emphasized that you don't want to think of technology as a monolithic block. There are very different types of technologies and they do very different things. And in fact, some of them help workers, but there is no guarantee that all will. And in particular, in this context, it is most relevant to distinguish between automation technologies such as robots that are very useful when there aren't workers to perform it, precisely because they are taking away tasks that workers used to perform. So those create displacement. But then there are other technologies, such as almost everything that people around you do, which are completely new tasks and new occupations, new activities that didn't exist 50 years ago. Those were made possible by technology that reinstated labor into the production process, creating new tasks, new human capabilities, or new human complementarity. So if you look at the US labor market, in the 40 years after World War II, you had very rapid automation causing displacement, but that was counterbalanced by other technological changes, very different in nature, that pulled in the other direction. And you can see that they are going in very different directions because this is adding to labor demand, this is subtracting from labor demand. And then if you look at the sum total of the two, that's the thick blue curve, is hovering around zero. Miraculously, the two canceled each other, and that's the reason why labor demand tracked productivity and GDP. But fast forward and look at the last 30 years, there's faster displacement, slower reinstatement, and the blue curve is now going south, explaining the pattern that I have shown you before. In other words, this is bolstering the case that we have adopted a very unbalanced portfolio of technological changes and innovations over the last 30 years. Too much in automation, which isn't bad in and of itself, but as in this picture, it needs to be counterbalanced by other technological changes, and that counterbalancing hasn't happened. This is a little abstract, so let me show you in the context of a specific technology, the one that I mentioned at the beginning, industrial robots. And as I've mentioned, it has been transformative in economies that had shortages of labor, especially middle-aged labor. It's also been very important for many industries such as automobiles, electronics, chemicals, which have completely retransformed their production processes, leading to significant productivity gains. But contrary to what you would expect if you believe that technological change always helps labor, if you look at the effects on labor, it's been fairly negative. So here I'm showing you that by zeroing in on within US comparison. So, and I'm showing that the places that have had more robot adoption or more exposed to robots, including the industrial heartland of the US, such as Detroit, Lansing, Beaumont, Cleveland, Toledo, but also true if you leave these places out, this cloud of points has exactly the same slope. The more robots impacted the local labor market, the more negative employment has been, and the same is true of wages. So very much just like this here, a pattern of non-shared growth because it's driven by automation. Once again, this is showcased by the US, but it isn't just a US phenomenon. So here I'm showing you the evolution of employment structure from the early 1990s to just before the Great Recession, so that this isn't affected by what happened during the financial crisis. And the red bar is how the middle class occupations, those in the middle of the income distribution, have changed. The green is the top third, blue is the bottom third. And what you can see is that in every OECD country for which we have data, the red bars are to the negative. These are blue-collar workers, clerical workers, retail workers, back office workers. These are the backbone of the middle class, and they have all shrunk. And that's exactly because of industrial automation such as robots, numerically controlled machines, but also a lot of the algorithmic or software-based automation that happened in back offices and offices and clerical occupations. Again, US does not stand out in any way as exceptional when you look at this picture, although the wage implications have been somewhat different. AI is the next phase of the big technology. Everybody is so excited about AI. I am sick of hearing one more or 10 more every day industry tech leader saying how amazing AI is going to be. And there is good reason to be excited about AI. And as a broad technological platform, it can be used for many, many different things. It can be used for automating, it can be used for increasing human productivity. But in practice, actually, my own research, recent research with David Otter, Joe Hazel, and Pasquale Restrepo shows that it has been shaped by the business model of big tech companies, and it has been used for the same type of automation that I have shown you with robots and other technologies a second ago. So we're not really seeing much of use of AI for making humans that much more productive, but a lot of it for automation. Why is this bias for automation? I think there are many reasons, and I want to mention a few of them, but I don't want to spend too much more time on this because I have two more trends I want to touch upon before I conclude. One is global competition. The rise of China put a lot of cost pressure on American and Western companies. They thought that to compete, they had to cut their wages. And automating and eliminating labor seemed one good way of doing so. Second, as I've indicated for AI, a small group of companies have become disproportionately influential in shaping the future path of technology, the direction of technology. And those tend to be companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, Netflix, that have a particular vision, extremely tiny workforces, and are interested in algorithmically automating everything. And that perspective has permeated academia, R&D community, all sorts of practices in the US and parts of the Western world. But in addition, government policy hasn't helped. For example, in the US, and again, this is true for many other countries also, the tax code subsidizes firms, and has done increasingly so, to adopt machines to replace labor. So if you look at the marginal tax, average marginal tax in the US, it's when you combine income taxes and payroll taxes, labor pays something about 25%. So out of every $4 paid to labor, $1 goes to the government. If you look at capital taxation, in the 1990s, it was around 15 to 20%. But since then, many tax reforms and many dodges have meant that capital is now taxed so little that especially capital engaged in automation, such as software and equipment, they've had more than a 15 percentage point decline in the taxes they face, and they are now facing a tax rate less than 5%. So what that means is that if as a company, you have a so-so automation technology that doesn't really save costs, but you can adopt it and eliminate labor, you'll make a lot of money. So therefore, the tax code encourages excessive automation. Now, the argument that tech industry representatives and enthusiasts would give at this point is that this automation is all part of the plan. This is what's going to bring huge technological gains and productivity improvements. Actually, reality is different. If you look at the staple measure that economists use for measuring the health of the macroeconomy, total factor productivity growth, we are going through one of the worst periods of total factor productivity growth since 2000. So total factor productivity growth used to be around 3%, sometimes 2%, which means that there was an additional growth of about 2% a year because of efficiency improvements or technological improvements. That number is around 0.5% today. So all that you read about AI and amazing machines and algorithms, we're not getting the fruits of that. And my own research suggests that that's because of excessive automation. A lot of that goes to automating things that shouldn't be automated yet, or shouldn't be automated at all, and doesn't go into low-hanging fruits that's going to make workers, especially workers without college degrees, more productive. This problem is deepened by COVID, like the other ones. In fact, probably more so than the other ones. Companies have all gone in the direction of more automation because they don't want to deal with social distancing or vulnerability to the virus or safety regulation. The future does not need to be fully automated. There are many things that machines are really terrible at doing. Billions of dollars are poured today in order to improve the machine technology, algorithms, in doing things that they are really not good at. But that's exactly an opportunity for humans to be centrally involved in the production process. And that, again, emphasizes that the direction of technology is a choice. And if companies are not themselves doing it, then, and there are good reasons for them not to do it in general, I'll come back to that. Regulation of technology has to be an important part of government policy. This has major implications for developing economies as well. And the reason is because right now, AI, robots, etc., may appear only relevant for developed nations. Not so. Already, when a company automates, that affects what they offshore, what they import. But more importantly, these technologies are going to spread around the world. And the developing world, including educated places like Armenia, as well as lower education places like parts of South Asia or Latin America have one thing in common. They are abundant in human resources and people. And AI and automation essentially is economizing on these. So this is a problem of workers, especially workers with low educational degrees in the Western labor markets, but it's also a problem of the developing world. This, I think, spells huge trouble. In Why Nations Fail, James Robinson and I define inclusive institutions as the bedrock of a healthy society and healthy growth, as arrangements which create incentives and opportunities for the broad cross-section of people. Throughout history, the main barrier to inclusivity was the excessive power of elites, sometimes often used via coercion or control of key assets. I believe that excessive and pervasive automation has created and will continue to create a different type of failure of inclusion, where the labor market, where most people opportunities originate, is going to become a tiered society. A small group of people, like the postgraduates I showed you, will have opportunities, but the rest will not. And that's going to be another complete failure of inclusivity. And that's why I put this emphasis on the regulation of technology, which I'm going to come to. So we have to have society be part of the conversation when the all-important direction of technology is decided. And of course, the best way of doing that is via civil society action and democratic institutions, which I'm going to talk about. But then comes the third trend. There is a huge retreat of democracy since the mid-2000s, which means that this most clear shock absorber in the economy, which is the democratic process, has actually ceased functioning properly. So in the 1990s and early 2000s, people were talking of the third wave, a huge increase in the number of democracies and democratic institutions spreading around the world. But actually, since 2006, the opposite has been the case. Every year since then, according to Freedom House, there have been more countries that have had their democratic institutions get worse. Armenia is in here, pretty much the majority of the years here, for example. US is here for the last several years. So for instance, if you take 2014, 62 countries have had worsening democratic scores, only 33 improvements. And this is bolstered or undergirded by, again, COVID-related events, but exploiting fault lines that existed before COVID. One important issue is that most democratic countries today report very low levels of trust in state and government institutions. This is a problem that got deepened after the financial crisis, but I think it is endemic in some places that actually have fairly healthy democracies, such as France, South Korea, Taiwan. And if you look at China, Singapore, and even Turkey, which have had fairly authoritarian governments, people express higher levels of trust. Part of it is brainwashing. Part of it is people are not saying the truth, what Timur Kuran called preference falsification. And part of it is because media and civil society are so weak that the whole conversation shifts. But this is, again, part of the problems that democracy is going to face. And on top of it, I want to mention, but since time is short, I'm going to be extremely brief on this one. All of these problems, even democracy, is actually a global problem. The fact that Hong Kong's democracy has collapsed is not a domestic problem. It was imposed by China. And the fact that China is becoming more and more authoritarian is not just a Chinese problem. It's going to have reverberations all around the world. But there are many more other live challenges. Climate change, as I mentioned, nuclear weapons. But inequality, that's a global challenge. A country like Switzerland, a major country, or even France, let alone Armenia or Mexico, doesn't decide its own technology. the direction of technology is decided in the largest, technologically most active economies, such as US, Germany, Canada, increasingly China in the area of AI. And the issue of capital versus labor taxation, well, that's an international problem. Part of the reason why capital is so lightly taxed is because capital uses increasingly the argument that it's so footloose it can go some other places. So to deal with all of these problems, we need global institutions, but the global institutions have become weaker and weaker. And most recently with the debacle of international vaccine distribution, which has been terrible and will probably extend the COVID crisis by 2 years, we are seeing the costs of this complete collapse or meltdown of international cooperation. Again, a problem that's been made worse by the COVID crisis. Both democracies are less successful. More authoritarian leaders have used, as in Turkey or Hungary, the excuse of COVID to clamp down on civil freedoms and the international cooperation. So is there any way out? So it seems like those two problems are really challenging. And the other two problems that I mentioned, including, and in addition to global change, global climate change, will all depend on international cooperation and better democratic institutions. I think there is, but it has to start domestically and then extend from domestic institutions to international cooperation more broadly. And this is what I call welfare state 3.0, a new way of constructing welfare state institutions. This, of course, has to include dealing with these international challenges, including climate change, as well as the issues of capital versus labor I mentioned. And again, I highlight regulation of technology because of the reasons I have articulated. And of course, we need even better regulation and social safety net for disruptions created by globalization, automation, and inequality. But that means a significant significant extension in the responsibilities on the shoulders of the state. And there is a bit of a problem. First of all, the political will for that is missing, but even if the political will was there, and part of the reason why the political will is missing is because people are afraid of the state becoming so strong. When you see the state become strong, it's in places like Hungary, Turkey, India. It has done so in an authoritarian direction, stamping out freedoms, civil society, democratic participation. This is exactly what this very important social scientist, economist Friedrich Hayek was worried about. In 1942, when the Beveridge Report came out in Britain in the middle of the war, it was a transformative event. Beveridge articulated a vision of a new welfare state, things that never existed in Britain and most of Europe, such as national health care, progressive taxation, minimum wages, aid to families with poor children, social insurance. And it was an electrifying moment for Britain, and many other countries followed it. Right after the war, Britain itself started instituting these policies during the war. But Hayek was worried. He was a recent emigre fleeing the Nazis from Vienna, was teaching at the LSE, my alma mater at the time, and he thought this would bring totalitarianism, a new totalitarianism, what he calls the road to serfdom, because the state would become so much stronger and society could not deal with it. The intervening 6 decades have proven Hayek wrong, in my opinion, quite demonstrably. Those institutions were adopted and democracy didn't become weaker in most of Europe. In fact, it became much stronger. Why is that? Well, that's actually one way of thinking about that is with the framework that James and I offered in our more recent book, The Narrow Corridor. And since I'm out of time, I will explain it in 30 seconds. It's actually very simple. A simplified version of the theory is that it's all between the balance between the state and society. If that balance is off, then Hayek would be right. The state becomes more and more strong and society becomes weaker, just as a despotic Leviathan path like in China. But when you have a balance, and this is the eponymous narrow corridor, you have very different dynamics. The state can become stronger, take on more responsibilities on its shoulders, but at the same time, society becomes stronger with democracy deepening. And that's exactly what happened in the post-war era. You had much more active civil society, media, politics of contention, criticism, monitoring of bureaucrats and politicians. That's the main reason, what we call the Red Queen effect in the book. Society running as fast as it can in order to keep up with the state, that was responsible for the success of post-war Europe, post-war US, post-war Canada, that spread to much of the rest of the world. The question is whether we can prove Hayek wrong again, and that will depend not just on adopting the right policies, such as directing technology, but also strengthening democratic institutions, and that's the real challenge. Okay, I will stop here, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Daron. All right, so let me start with one question about the decline in middle-class jobs and salaries. When you sort of follow media, media pays more attention to something else, outsourcing. Jobs going to China from US in particular. So what's your take on it? Which one is
I think they're both important, actually. I didn't mean not that. And in fact, the logic is very similar. So what is automation? You find ways of performing certain tasks with capital that's cheaper than workers. And offshoring is you find, again, using technology. You wouldn't be able to offshore anything without very advanced technology. You find ways of using advances in communication technology, transport, design, to offshore parts of the production process to China, Vietnam, Indonesia. So in our empirical work, we have looked at both of them, and they both play a role, but actually automation, broadly defined, plays a more important role than offshoring. And in addition to offshoring, there's also imports from China. The difference is that, for example, if you do offshoring, for example, in computers, computer production still stays in the US, but some of the jobs go away. But with imports, then firms go bust as well. Both of them have different effects. But essentially, when you look, especially focusing on, say, the labor share in value added, import competition doesn't matter because all production value added disappears from the US because they're being produced in China. But the one that's most relevant for that is offshoring and automation.
Right. So you mentioned that this automation is going to affect developing world as well. But the technology is mostly driven by a few countries, essentially. And the policy choices those countries make basically are going to define the future of the world. So is there anything these developing countries can also do to affect that future?
Great, yes. I think there are two things that can be done, but none of them are surefire ways of dealing with it. First of all, it's not a law of nature that only US, China, and Canada should determine the direction of technology. It was exactly the same when it came to agricultural technology in the 1950s. US, Germany, Europe, and a few other countries determined which types of seeds, which types of hybrids were being produced. And they were very inappropriate to the needs of the developing world. So then the developing world recognized this, came together, a number of them, including the Philippines, Indonesia, India, Mexico, Brazil. They formed consortia with help from philanthropic organizations such as Rockefeller Foundation and Ford Foundation, but most of it really driven by completely researchers in India, in the Philippines, and they came up with seeds that were appropriate to the conditions, such as hybrid corn or hybrid wheat. And that was the basis of what became known as the Green Revolution. So the developing world, if it fixed its nationalism and democracy problem, could actually turn its attention to this and could start becoming a player in this. But more importantly, I think in addition to its own investments, it has to have a voice. And again, if you have the United Nations, for example, act as an umbrella organization and speak in a unified voice for 5 billion people who are not covered by Europe, US, and China, that voice can have impact in a world in which international cooperation, international institutions work. So that's why these different parts, as I said, are very synergistic. So either I have frozen or Armen has frozen. Is it me?
No, I think you're okay, sir. Give us just one quick second. Let's see if we could get Armen back on.
Okay, well, in the meantime, if people want to just ask their questions, you should feel free to do so.
Dr. Sure. Dr. Gabrielian has a question.
Yeah, just turn on your camera and microphone and ask. Don't.
Vachajam, would you mind asking your question?
Sure. Hello.
Hi.
I hope I can be now.
Hi,
I asked you to comment. I have written on Turchin's hypothesis of overproduction of elites. Do you believe it can have impact on the stabilization of democracies during recent decades, and whether social media amplified it?
That's a great question. Yes, I do believe that elite frustration has been a very destabilizing force during certain junctures. And therefore, I think Turchin is onto something important. What I am less certain is his bigger theory, which embeds this in deterministic forces related to population size, etc. I think there is less evidence on that. But certainly, I agree that part of the developing countries' frustration is because they have their domestic elites that haven't been really empowered. And that has been, for example, an important driver of nationalism. So if you look at many regimes around the world, or many countries around the world, from Hungary to Turkey to Philippines to Brazil to India, they are sometimes put under the umbrella of right-wing populism or authoritarian populism. But actually what's common among these regimes or these countries is that they are very nationalistic regimes, and they are using nationalism, and that nationalism is often related to the frustration of, I wouldn't say elites, but, because it depends on what you mean by elites, but the educated segment of those countries' population that had high aspirations but haven't been completely empowered in the global economy. Welcome back, Armen.
Yes, I'm back, but in the process, somehow my computer, turned off. But in the process, I think what I lost is the chat. So the people were asking questions in the chat, and
well, let me. There is Artishes Tonoyan. If you want to ask your question, you can.
Hi, sure.
Hi,
thanks.
How are you doing?
Thanks, I'm fine. First of all, thanks for this great presentation. Indeed, very informative and useful. But my question is actually related to what Vacha has raised. So do you think? I mean, you mentioned that laissez-faire and the current state of democratic system is not in a best shape to solve the rise in the inequality. Because from one side, I mean, we would like the innovation to happen, scientists to come up with the research and get, 70 billion valuation from U.S. stock markets. Mm-hmm. And then these guys get 25 like billionaires, and meanwhile others live with $1 per day in the rest of the world. And what you suggest is a tougher regulation, but tougher regulation in my understanding essentially is the redistribution of the wealth, because as long as we allow and we promote the creation of the wealth for a 70 billion of a valuation as a Coinbase or other startups, then we somehow need to tell these guys, look, you know what, somehow you need to put this half of it, I'm just, naming numbers, to the rest of the world, because, they are either less educated or whatsoever, and that's not going to be fair deal. So it means that either you need to impose it by force, and we go again the libertarian thinking, or we leave it as it is. And eventually it ends up either in rising inequality and we have war or revolution as an outcome, or we have a suppressed societies, that you would see in the science fictions like Elysium. You have white people living somewhere in the white air with the longevity of the life, and others just, as slaves struggling with the daily lives. So this is more or less like, you know, my deliberation. Please comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, I think that's very useful that you raised this, Arteshas, because I did not have time to expand on what I meant by regulation of technology. And what I do not mean is, you know, taxing the wealth of those who make money in technology. That may be necessary for other reasons, but that's not what I have focused on. And I don't mean blocking of technology. What I have in mind much more is along the lines of what I emphasized, but I didn't tie it back there, so you're absolutely right in asking this, is redirection of technological change. And what I mean by that is, let me give you an example to clarify which both what I mean in terms of what needs to be done and how it can be done. The energy sector. Starting around the 1970s, especially in the 1980s, people started understanding that different types of energy had very different social consequences, especially with fossil fuel or methane-based energy or methane-emitting energy, leading to much worse social consequences because of global warming and increases in the carbon concentration in the atmosphere. The way to respond to that is not to just block technological change or tax the wealthy, but was to redirect technological change towards cleaner forms of energy. And in fact, miraculously, despite the fact that there's been a lot of political dysfunction, the world has done that extremely well. If you wanted to use solar or wind energy in 1980s, it would have been prohibitively costly. Today, those energy sources, as well as geothermal energy, are cost effective. They cannot be stored, and there are some issues of allocating it, but they are cost effective in things that you can do for example, heating. So how did we achieve that? Well, first of all, it wasn't the market economy. The energy firms did not want to do any of that transition. But there was a number of key policies. Carbon taxes started in a number of countries, not in the US, but also subsidies to green energy became widespread in Europe, Canada, the US, and then later in China. So there was the regulation of technology was the government saying, well, some type of technologies are creating negative social consequences, so we're going to encourage other types of technology. But that wasn't alone. Even as important was that consumers and workers started becoming aware of the problem of climate change. So they started putting pressure on companies. You know, the tech industry, which emerged in the 2000s as one of the biggest energy consumers, at some point they had to say we have to reduce our carbon footprint because their employees were putting pressure. And many consumers themselves didn't want to buy the gas guzzlers, they wanted electric cars or hybrid cars. And that really redirected technological change in the car industry. So what I'm talking about is a transformation of this sort, so that we do not use AI and as well as other digital technologies just for automation, but do what we did, for example, perhaps inadvertently in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, which was use a lot of these technological know-how for creating new tasks, new competencies, new complementarities which we want.
All right. I don't know if there are other questions. I don't see the chat. I could ask a question if there is no one else.
Armen, am I mute or unmute?
All right,
Daron?
please
Yeah.
go ahead.
Also, you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I put just a quick mark on the chat, and I've been thinking about this long time. Eventually, AI technology, whether it's in energy sector or some other sector, will lead in the most developed capitalist countries to exactly things that you have described. There will be a sector, a big labor market, which will have nowhere to go. ATMs just made a lot of tellers free of jobs. I mean, tomorrow, self-driving cars and new technology, we are hearing this RoboMart, what it's called, right? We heard of
Yes,
the new.
absolutely.
Yeah, so all these things are going to let people go, including even if we direct technology into sustainable development, how many miners we have in the world, the oil industry, people who are involved, all these folks will have nowhere to go. My question is, eventually, the economy should think about a new model of capitalism or a socialism or something that the life is going to dictate. Because what you explained, we have to somehow let these other people live, and we have to somehow redistribute the wealth. Because I liked your definition that people who have money, whether corporations or individuals, they will be relying more on capital than the people. And then what we do with the rest of them? And I think for them, it's better to understand this sooner or later and start kind of rethinking Marxist capitalism theory in the new way, including all the other challenges, the global warming, and this pandemic. It's a kind of a new thing which still nobody can understand what it's leading to. Sorry for a long question, but I hope.
Okay, well, no, let me jump in there, Suren. Thank you very much. So you're absolutely right. You know, there is a future. There's a path to the future, which looks exactly like what you described. And that's, I think, is a scary one. And if that's the path that we're going to take, we have to think about options such as universal basic income or other ways of redistributing wealth, other ways of creating meaning for people. But stepping back for a second, that path, in some sense, is undergirded in a structure of production in which the set of tasks and the set of activities remains fixed, and machines, algorithms take more and more of them, and fewer of them are left for humans. Now, you could have said exactly the same thing in 1860. 60% of people in the US, more than 60% in many other Western economies, were in agriculture. And a rapid process of mechanization of agriculture started. Labor share in agriculture was halved in about 50 years. Labor input into agriculture declined more than half in many parts of the Western world. So that was a much bigger shock in terms of displacement of labor than the truck drivers losing their jobs to autonomous vehicles. But what happened? Well, what happened is that simultaneously or shortly thereafter, we used technology to generate completely new tasks, completely new activities that nobody could have dreamed of in 1850. If you look at where people were employed in the US, factories boomed. So now the factory workers, of course, you had them in the 1850s, but the way that the factories were organized, especially with electrification, was very different. So many of the things that they were doing were new tasks, much more productive tasks. But actually, the thing that really expanded in factories weren't the production workers. In the 1850s, you didn't have any non-production, white-collar workers in factories. You didn't have clerks, you didn't have engineers, you didn't have maintenance workers, you didn't have back-office workers. All of these occupations cropped up in the 1910s, 1920s. They made the production process much more rational, much more powerful, much more efficient. And then the whole service industry, retail workers, wholesale workers, education, health, all of these exploded, many of them using new technologies, many of them doing things that did not exist. If you look at the US Census, you'll see that many people are now employed in the 1940s in tasks that did not even exist in people's vocabulary in the 1910s or 1900s. So if you were sitting and having this conversation in the 1860s, you could have said the same thing. And that's not what happened. Now, you can say, well, this time is different. Perhaps we've exhausted all of these possibilities. There are no more tasks. But I don't believe so. If you look at it, there are countless new activities that can be produced in education, in healthcare, in production, using virtual reality, augmented reality, completely revolutionary educational strategies, or in education or in healthcare, very different ways of delivery based on much more real-time information. All of those things are feasible, but they're not being developed because we're not investing in them. So that's why I'm not willing to give up and say we have to go to this dystopic future where everything's done by machines yet. But I fear if we don't do the right things, we may head there.
All right, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks. This was a very good conversation.
Right. All right, guys, our time is up. I would like to ask everyone to stay because there will be an announcement from the alumni office. In the meantime, I want to thank again Daron Acemoglu for a wonderful presentation. I want to thank everyone for participating in this seminar, and also I want to thank the alumni office for helping us put it together. All right.
Thank you, Armen. Thank you, everybody.
Perfect.
Thank you, Narek.
Thank you very, very much just for this awesome presentation. And Armenjan, thank you so much for helping us organize this wonderful series of webinars. Before we let everyone go to our wonderful alumni community, we have another event next week with our president and our interim provost to talk about our newly established centers of excellence. So if you guys have not yet registered for that event, I'm going to put the link to the link in our chat here. So please make sure to register for that event also. And thank you so much for participating today. And thank you for the great presentation again, Doctor.
Thank you. I will look forward to having an opportunity to meet many of you in person in some future date. Bye-bye.
You're welcome in Armenia anytime.
Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks again. Have a good day, guys.